I used to be invisible, not in a tragic teenage angst kind of way, but in that quiet, forgettable presence you find sitting in the corner of a corporate meeting, always taking notes, never speaking unless asked. I was 33, single, working in HR for a mid-size marketing firm in Chicago. For years, I'd lived in the background, doing my job well enough to be dependable but not remarkable. I'd blend into office culture, wearing the same safe, muted colors, eating lunch alone, always available to listen to others but never really seen. It was easier that way, especially when you're the bigger girl in the room. People are kinder when they pretend not to notice you. But at the beginning of that year, something in me cracked. It wasn't some New Year's resolution or a breakup that fueled it. It was quiet, gradual. I just got tired. Tired of being overlooked. Tired of feeling like I didn't belong in my own skin. So I started walking in the evenings. I swapped soda for water. I got a therapist. No one noticed at first, which was fine. This wasn't for them, it was for me. By summer, though, the difference was undeniable. I'd lost over 30 pounds, I had better posture, and maybe the most shocking part, I started wearing color. Bright dresses, red lipstick, bold shoes. I felt like I was finally catching up to the version of myself that had been trapped inside for years. That's when Heather noticed. Heather was our department director. Early 40s, sleek, sharp, commanding. The kind of woman who could walk into any room and have people stand straighter without realizing why. She wasn't cruel, at least not on the surface. But her compliments always came with an aftertaste. "You're really glowing lately," she said the first time I wore something fitted. "That dress is so brave." Or, "You look like you've lost a ton of weight. Good for you. Just don't disappear on us." I smiled and thanked her, but my skin prickled every time. It started subtly. During meetings, she'd forget to mention my contributions or casually correct me in front of others when I wasn't even wrong. Once, when I offered to run a wellness workshop for employees, something I'd been quietly developing, she said, "That's sweet, but let's have someone with more credibility handle it." Her tone was light, but the message was clear. And yet, I kept going because I had finally stopped apologizing for existing. The real shift came one afternoon in the break room. I overheard two junior staffers whispering near the fridge. One said, "I mean, she's doing well and all, but Heather says it's just for attention." I didn't say anything. I just stood there, frozen, yogurt in hand, heart sinking slowly. Attention? That's what this was to her? I returned to my desk and tried to shake it off, but it gnawed at me. A few days later, someone accidentally copied me on an email thread I wasn't supposed to see. It was between Heather and another manager. My name came up. "She's clearly going through something," Heather wrote. "Hope it doesn't affect her judgment long term. People who change too fast usually burn out." That was the moment I realized this wasn't passive-aggressive curiosity. It was sabotage dressed as concern. I wanted to believe it was just insecurity on her part, that maybe I was misreading everything, but deep down I knew better. This wasn't in my head. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. She didn't hate me for what I was. She hated me for becoming something she could no longer control. That smile she gave me in the hallway, the one I used to think meant approval, it wasn't approval, it was a warning. Things escalated slowly, like a pot left on simmer that eventually boiled over when no one was watching. After that email I wasn't supposed to see, I began paying closer attention. Heather's words echoed in my head during every interaction, her fake smiles and saccharine tone now loaded with meaning I hadn't noticed before. What once passed as casual managerial oversight started to feel like a pattern. Meetings where I used to be asked for input now went by without my name being mentioned. Projects I had been quietly leading were suddenly reassigned to newer employees under the guise of giving them development opportunities. When I asked Heather about it, she smiled and said, "You've just been under a lot of change lately. Thought it might be nice to let you breathe." I tried not to let it get to me. I kept doing my work. I stayed polite, professional, focused, but the signs were impossible to ignore. I'd walk into rooms and conversations would stop. People started treating me differently. Not outright hostile, just distant. I'd send emails and get no replies, only for someone else to forward the same idea later with their name attached. I wasn't just being sidelined, I was being erased. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I'd become paranoid. After all, Heather never yelled, never threatened me. Everything she did was so subtle, so dressed in professionalism, that calling it out would make me look hysterical. And that was the part that hurt the most, how calculated it was. She knew exactly how far she could go without stepping over a line that could be used against her. She was the queen of plausible deniability. The worst part came during a department-wide strategy meeting. We'd been prepping for it for weeks, and I had built a full proposal for improving employee retention, complete with survey data, comparative analysis, and a timeline for implementation. I submitted it to Heather a few days in advance, and she'd emailed me back with a thumbs-up emoji. During the meeting, she presented the proposal, word for word, as her own. She even used my slide deck, just with the footer logo swapped out. She didn't mention me once. I sat in that room, surrounded by our peers, listening to my work being applauded while I disappeared inside my own skin. A younger colleague leaned over during the applause and whispered, "That was brilliant. You helped with that, right?" I nodded with a tight smile, heart pounding, nausea rising. When the meeting ended, Heather gave me a wink as she walked past. My hands were shaking too much to type when I got back to my desk. After that, things started to spiral. One of the junior analysts came to me privately and said Heather had warned her not to get too close to me. She said, "You're kind of intense lately," she confessed, "like you've got something to prove." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I felt like I was being gaslit by my own boss in front of the entire department and no one even realized it. Or maybe they did and just didn't care enough to get involved. Then came the wellness concern. HR, my own department, scheduled a mandatory meeting with me, saying they had received anonymous input that I was exhibiting signs of stress that could affect team morale. The irony nearly made me choke. I sat in a conference room across from a younger HR associate who was nervously reading off a scripted list of questions. Was I sleeping well? Had I experienced mood swings? Did I feel supported in my role? I answered everything calmly, measured, aware that anything I said could be misinterpreted. I knew exactly where this was coming from. After the meeting, I walked straight to the stairwell and sat down on the 5th floor landing where no one ever went. I stared at the concrete wall and thought, maybe I should just quit. Maybe she wins. That's what she wants anyway. She wants me out. She wants me back in that shell, invisible and compliant. I closed my eyes, breathed deep, and imagined walking into her office, handing in my resignation, watching her smug smile widen just enough for her to think she'd won. And then I opened my eyes, and the thought of her satisfaction made me furious. I wasn't going to give her the ending she wanted. I wasn't going to walk away from my own story because someone else couldn't handle my evolution. I had worked too damn hard to disappear again. If she wanted a fight, I'd give her one. But I wouldn't fight like her. Cowardly, underhanded, manipulative. I'd fight smart, quiet, controlled, documented. That night, I started backing up everything: emails, chat logs, calendar invites. I created a private folder, encrypted, accessible only from my home computer. I went through every interaction we'd had over the last 6 months, every weird email, every incident, every removed task, every credit stolen. I logged it all in a private journal. I noted times, dates, witnesses. I spoke to no one. I smiled at her in the hallway. I kept performing. I played the part she wrote for me, all while rewriting the script behind the scenes. And somewhere in the middle of that storm, something changed in me. I stopped being afraid. I stopped doubting what I knew, because now I had evidence. I had control. I had clarity. She had taught me the rules of her game, and I was ready to beat her at it. Not loudly, not angrily, but thoroughly. Because this wasn't just about office politics anymore. This was about the quiet war women fight every day in places where they're supposed to be safe. This was about the girls who are told to be grateful for attention and the women who are punished when they stop shrinking to make others comfortable. This was about me, and I was done playing small. There's a moment when fear transforms into focus. I remember sitting at my kitchen table late one night, laptop open, spreadsheet glowing in the dim light. Each row held a different entry: a date, a description, a screenshot file name, a name of a witness when possible. It looked like a crime scene log, and in some ways it was. This wasn't just office drama anymore. This was harassment, psychological warfare, a calculated attempt to silence and discredit me. And I wasn't going to let her win. I knew Heather had power, but I had truth. And now I had a plan. I stopped reacting to anything emotionally. That was the first shift. I wouldn't flinch when she cut me off in meetings or rolled her eyes when I spoke. I stopped trying to defend myself. Instead, I listened. I took note of who laughed at her comments, who looked uncomfortable, who avoided eye contact afterward. These weren't just coworkers anymore, they were chess pieces, allies, bystanders, weak links. Heather played to her audience, and the more I watched her, the more I realized how fragile her control really was. It was all performance, sharp suits, clever phrases, performative empathy, but underneath it, she was terrified of irrelevance. She needed admiration like oxygen. Around this time, I reconnected with someone I hadn't spoken to in a while, Michelle, a senior compliance officer in another department. Years ago, I'd helped her during a difficult transition when her former supervisor tried to cover up payroll discrepancies. It wasn't a huge scandal, but I'd stood by her when others didn't. We'd drifted since then, but she was still in the building, still sharp, still watching. I invited her to lunch under the pretense of catching up, but by the end of the meal, I'd told her everything. Not in a dramatic way, just facts, dates, emails, behavior. I showed her my folder. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, "This isn't just unprofessional, this is a pattern. And if it's happening to you, it's probably happened before." That sentence stayed with me for days, because she was right. Heather had been in her position for years. I wasn't her first target. I was just the first one prepared to fight back. I started digging discreetly into old exit interviews. Some were vague, but others hinted at the same themes: a hostile environment, unrecognized contributions, a lack of transparency and trust at the leadership level. No names were mentioned, of course, but I knew. I could see her fingerprints all over it. Then came the tipping point. A project I'd spent 2 months developing was canceled with no explanation. The next week, a nearly identical initiative was launched under Heather's name. I hadn't even been informed until I saw it in the internal newsletter. My stomach dropped when I saw my original title repackaged with a sleeker font and someone else's byline. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. That day, after the newsletter went out, a junior associate came to my desk and said, "Didn't you pitch this exact thing like 3 weeks ago?" I just nodded. She frowned. "That's messed up." It was the first time someone had said it out loud. A few days later, another coworker, Lisa, invited me for coffee. She was quiet, uncomfortable, clearly unsure of how to say what she wanted. Eventually, she confessed that Heather had told her to keep an eye on me and report any signs of instability or outbursts. Lisa looked mortified. "I didn't even know what that meant. You've always been calm," but I think she was trying to build a case or something. It clicked. Heather wasn't just bullying me. She was setting me up, creating a paper trail, planting seeds. If I lost my temper, she'd have witnesses ready to swear I was unfit for the workplace. If I quit, she'd tell everyone I just couldn't handle the pressure. Either way, she'd win, unless I got ahead of her. I spent the next 2 weeks refining every piece of my documentation. I organized my folder like a legal case. I added timestamps, internal policies she had violated, matched behaviors to specific sections of the employee handbook. I even kept printed copies off-site just in case. I didn't trust our IT systems anymore. I began rehearsing what I would say if I needed to go to the executive leadership team or HR's upper management, not the day-to-day staffers I worked with, but the people who had the authority to actually do something. And in the background, I continued to smile. I helped coworkers, responded to emails, stayed late when needed. I gave Heather no visible reason to escalate. That was part of the strategy. Let her get comfortable again. Let her think the storm had passed. She didn't know that I was preparing the thunder. Then, as if the universe had decided it was time, something happened. An old colleague named Brendan messaged me out of the blue. We hadn't worked together in over a year. He said he'd heard rumors that Heather was at it again and wanted to know if I was okay. I asked what he meant. He hesitated, then told me that she had nearly cost him his job the previous year after falsely accusing him of mishandling confidential data. He'd never reported it formally, too scared, too worn down, but he had kept the email threads. I asked if he'd be willing to send them to me. He didn't respond immediately, but the next morning there they were, a full PDF of their conversation along with a personal note. "I should have done this sooner. Good luck." That was it, the final puzzle piece, a pattern, a precedent, a witness. I remember staring at my screen that night, hands trembling, not with fear, but with clarity. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every person Heather had quietly destroyed and erased over the years. This was about setting something straight in a place where everyone had learned to look away, and I was ready. Because she thought I'd break. She thought I'd fade back into the version of myself that was too afraid to speak, too polite to push back, but she was wrong. I didn't change so she'd notice me. I changed so I could finally see her for what she really was. And I was about to show the whole company, too. The week I decided to act, everything at the office felt sharper, more deliberate. Every hallway conversation, every passive comment, every look from Heather landed differently. I wasn't just enduring anymore. I was watching, tracking, waiting. She didn't know it, but her time was running out. I didn't need revenge that looked like an explosion. I wanted a quiet collapse, the kind you can't blame on anyone but yourself. The kind of downfall that's entirely self-inflicted, just with the right amount of pressure applied in the right places. I had the evidence. Now I needed timing and one last opportunity to tie it all together. It came on a Wednesday morning. I arrived earlier than usual, and noticed the lights on in our department were already glowing. Heather was there in the conference room, laughing with a senior executive I barely ever saw in our building, Dan, the CFO. She wore a bold red blazer, more makeup than usual, and a kind of performative polish that immediately set off alarms. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I saw the way she leaned forward, hands expressive, that sharp smile slicing through her sentences like a blade dipped in honey. I ducked away before she saw me. Whatever she was doing, she was setting something up, and I had a gut feeling it wasn't going to benefit anyone but her. Later that day, I got an invite to a performance review discussion scheduled for Friday morning from Heather. It was unexpected and out of cycle, not our normal quarterly meeting. No warning, no reason, just a subject line, performance check-in. My stomach clenched, but I didn't flinch. I knew exactly what this was. She was going to try to officially document me as unstable, insubordinate, whatever she needed to justify pushing me out. But she didn't know that I had already taken steps far beyond her reach. That same day, I contacted Michelle again, the compliance officer I'd confided in weeks ago. I asked if we could talk confidentially. Not in the cafeteria, not in the building. We met at a cafe 3 blocks away after work. I brought a printed file, copies of everything I'd gathered, including Brendan's documentation, timelines, code of conduct violations, and a personal statement. She read through it slowly, carefully, and said only one thing when she finished. You need to send this to corporate ethics and risk management, not HR, not your department head, straight to the top. She explained that Heather had protection in our local HR structure, friends, people she had helped promote, people who owed her favors. If I filed a formal complaint through the usual route, it would get handled quietly, internally, and buried. I needed to go higher. Independent oversight, people with real power and no personal allegiance. It would trigger a mandatory review. It wouldn't be quiet, but it would be real. That night, I barely slept. I crafted a carefully worded email to the corporate ethics and compliance officer, attaching the file Michelle had reviewed. I included a cover letter stating my intent, the timeline, and that I was submitting this in good faith with supporting evidence and corroborating witness statements. I hit send at 2:08 a.m. I stared at the screen for a few more minutes, then closed my laptop and lay in bed in complete silence. Thursday passed in a strange blur. Heather seemed in unusually good spirits, which only confirmed for me that she thought she was in control. She even complimented my shoes that day, said they made me look strong, like someone trying to make a statement. I thanked her. That afternoon, I saw her talking with Dan again, laughing. Whatever she was planning, she thought it was already working. And in a way, it was. She just had no idea who the real target was now. Friday morning came like a thunderclap. I walked into the conference room exactly on time, clutching a notepad I didn't need. Heather was already seated, a faux warm smile on her face. "Thanks for coming," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite her. Her tone was overly casual, as if we were catching up over coffee, instead of sitting down for what she hoped would be the beginning of the end of my career. She started with small talk. "You've been evolving so much lately," she said. "I wanted to check in, see how you're adjusting. I let her talk. I nodded where appropriate. I took mental notes. She pivoted, of course, into comments about team dynamics and concerns raised about communication style. No sources, no specifics, just smoke. And then, just as she began suggesting we create a performance improvement plan, her laptop pinged. A new email. She glanced at it, paused, and suddenly her face changed. Slight tension in the jaw, a flicker in her eyes. She kept talking, but I could see her slipping. She knew something was off. Moments later, her phone buzzed. Again, this time she checked it and excused herself for just a moment. She stepped out of the room. I sat still, heart hammering. She was gone for over 5 minutes. When she returned, the blood had drained from her face. She wrapped up the meeting quickly, said she'd circle back with formal notes, and practically fled the room. I walked back to my desk with my pulse pounding. 20 minutes later, an all-staff email arrived. The Ethics and Compliance Division will be conducting a routine audit and leadership review next week. Your cooperation is appreciated. Routine, right? By Monday, it was no longer routine. People were being interviewed, files were being pulled. An unfamiliar executive, someone from out-of-state headquarters, started roaming the building. Heather became scarce, constantly behind closed doors or working from home. Whispers filled the office. Tension crackled in the air like static electricity. People started asking questions. And for the first time in months, no one was avoiding me. They were watching me. Some looked impressed. Some looked scared. Some looked guilty. And Heather, she was unraveling. She thought she'd walk me to the edge. She never expected I'd learn how to fly. The audit didn't start with fireworks. It started with silence, controlled corporate silence, the kind that slides under doors and into inboxes without warning. Monday came with clipped conversations and nervous glances, and by Tuesday morning, half the building was whispering. People began receiving calendar invites from names they didn't recognize, internal auditors flown in from the headquarters in New York. The subject lines were clinical, leadership feedback interview 30 minutes. By Wednesday, it was clear this wasn't a routine check-in, it was a full-scale investigation. And Heather? She was at the center of it. I kept my head down, but my ears open. I wasn't the only one. Employees who had been carefully neutral for months now started checking in with me. Casually, but purposefully. Did you hear who they talked to today? I wonder if they're going to ask about project reallocations. Remember when she said that thing in the meeting last month? People were remembering. Finally, Heather had ruled through implication and reputation, but the moment that spell broke, people saw her for what she was, a manipulator with a taste for control and a fear of being irrelevant. And the more she flailed, the more obvious it became. She tried to act composed. She wore her usual designer blazers, clicked through the hallways with forced confidence, smiled too wide during meetings, but the cracks were visible. She called in sick for the first time in years. When she was in the office, she barely spoke. She stopped making eye contact with me. On Thursday, I walked past her glass-walled office and saw her staring blankly at her monitor, fingers unmoving, eyes unfocused. She didn't even notice me. That same day, I received my own invite. My interview was scheduled for Friday morning at 10 a.m. in a reserved conference room on the executive floor. No explanation, just the meeting title and a line that said, "Your perspective is valuable." I arrived early, hands steady, not out of confidence, but out of exhaustion. I was done being afraid. A woman named Evelyn greeted me at the door, polished, early 50s, the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. She thanked me for coming, offered me water, and then gently asked me to walk her through my experience with Heather. I didn't dramatize anything. I spoke clearly, factually, just as I had prepared. I explained the reassignments, the slights, the stolen credit, the wellness flag from HR, the performance check-in that had no basis. I provided dates, descriptions, names. I offered the digital file, but Evelyn held up her hand and said, "We already have what we need. I just wanted to hear it from you directly." Her tone wasn't reassuring. It was confirming. They knew. After the interview, I went back to my desk and resumed my work like nothing had happened. That's what everyone was doing, pretending the floor wasn't shaking beneath us. By now, people knew something serious was happening, and most of them suspected Heather's downfall was imminent. It wasn't just whispers anymore. It was open discussion. Some people were sympathetic, some were gleeful, most were careful. No one was surprised. On Monday morning, it finally happened. Heather didn't show up to work. An email came out from the regional director around 9 a.m. stating that Heather Lewis is no longer with the company effective immediately. Leadership transition plans will be communicated shortly. No explanation, no send-off, no farewell party, just gone. A few people gasped when the email hit their inbox. One person clapped softly before stopping themselves. I stared at the screen for a moment, then minimized the message and kept typing. I didn't need to say anything. But the day wasn't done with me yet. At 3:45 p.m., I was called into another meeting, this one with Dan, the CFO. He'd never spoken to me directly before. I entered the room cautiously, unsure of what to expect. He stood to greet me, thanked me for my time, and got straight to the point. We're restructuring leadership in your department. Based on the recommendations from the audit team and your work record, we'd like to offer you the position of interim department lead, starting immediately. I blinked. He smiled, but not kindly, professionally. You've been doing the work for a long time. We've noticed. We're just making it official. I didn't say yes immediately. I asked questions, clarified responsibilities, negotiated my salary. I wasn't the same woman who once sat silent in meetings and let others take credit for her work. I had learned to speak, and now they had no choice but to listen. By the end of the week, I was moved into Heather's old office. I didn't bring in flowers or personal photos. I kept the walls bare and the desk clean. On my first day in that chair, I walked to the window and looked down at the street below. Same building, same city, same person, but everything had changed. In the days that followed, people began treating me differently, not just with respect, but with careful curiosity. Some looked at me like I was a threat. Some looked at me like a savior. A few came to me and apologized, quietly, for not speaking up sooner. I didn't hold grudges. I had no energy left for that. But I remembered who they were, just like I remembered the ones who whispered behind doors and smirked when Heather made her little comments. I led differently. I gave credit. I asked questions. I lifted up the ones who had been shoved aside. I wasn't interested in being liked. I was interested in being just. I had survived something most people didn't even realize was happening, and now, the silence that once smothered me had become my weapon. Heather didn't get a goodbye. She didn't get a redemption arc or a public breakdown. She just vanished. And that, I realized, was the real power in how it all ended. There was no explosion, just silence, just absence, just the sound of doors closing behind her and never opening again. She had spent months trying to make me disappear. Instead, she became the one no one mentioned anymore. And me? I was just getting started. The thing about winning is that no one really prepares you for the silence that comes afterward. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of recalibration. After Heather was gone and I'd taken her office, people didn't know how to approach me anymore. Some avoided eye contact altogether, others hovered too long as if waiting for a sign that I was still the same woman who used to sit at the end of the table and quietly nod along. But I wasn't. That version of me had been slowly dying for months, and the woman now sitting in the high-backed leather chair she once claimed as her throne had no intention of bringing her back. At first, everything felt like an out-of-body experience. I'd walk into meetings and hear my own voice issuing decisions, delegating tasks, approving projects. People nodded, took notes, followed instructions. It was surreal. I wasn't used to being the voice in the room that people listened to because they had to, not because they were being polite. There was power in that, heavy, quiet power, and I was learning how to carry it. Heather's absence created a strange vacuum. For years, she had operated like a shadow director. Nothing happened without her approval, even things that technically had nothing to do with her. She'd spread her influence like a vine, wrapping herself around every process, every conversation, making herself indispensable. But when she was gone, the structure didn't collapse. In fact, it moved more smoothly. It was like everyone suddenly exhaled after holding their breath for too long. Decisions were made faster, collaboration increased, and people smiled more often. The toxic fog had lifted. But not everything disappeared with her. There were still remnants, habits, fears, little defense mechanisms people had developed just to survive her. Employees were hesitant to speak candidly, afraid their words might be used against them later. It would take time to unlearn that. Trust had to be rebuilt. Not just in leadership, but in the idea that this place could be safe, fair, human. So I made that my first priority. I started holding weekly one-on-one check-ins with every member of the department, not just managers, everyone. Assistants, interns, people in back office roles who were never invited into leadership meetings before. I asked about their goals, their frustrations, their ideas. I took notes, I followed up. And slowly, they began to open up. People started pitching ideas again. Volunteers for projects came forward without being coerced. There was a noticeable change in the air. Not euphoria, not yet, but something calmer, healthier. Still, not everyone was thrilled. There were a few who had been close to Heather, beneficiaries of her favoritism, her protectors, or perhaps just people who feared change. I saw it in the way they hesitated when I gave direction, or how they'd bring up how Heather used to do it, but I wasn't interested in comparisons. I didn't raise my voice or argue. I let my work speak, and over time, the resistance softened. Some of them even came around. Others faded into the background, unsure how to operate without someone else pulling their strings. Around the third week in my new role, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. It was brief, unsigned, no greeting, just one line. "You really thought you won, didn't you?" For a moment, I just stared at it. No name, no context. But I knew. Heather. Of course she was angry. She thought she'd been taken down by luck, by betrayal, by backroom politics. She couldn't accept the fact that her own behavior had built the case against her. I didn't reply. I flagged the message, forwarded it to compliance, and moved on. What struck me most in those weeks wasn't the absence of Heather's voice. It was the absence of my own internal doubt. For the first time in years, I didn't second-guess every word I said in meetings. I didn't rehearse my sentences before speaking. I didn't shrink myself to fit into the room. I simply existed, fully, openly, unapologetically. And the people around me responded to that. They didn't just respect me, they started to believe in me. It wasn't long before people from other departments reached out asking how we had turned things around so quickly. They wanted advice, guidance, a blueprint. I began mentoring a few junior leaders in the company, helping them recognize the early signs of toxicity, teaching them how to speak up, how to build credibility without stepping on others. For the first time in my professional life, I felt like I was creating something instead of just surviving it. But perhaps the most unexpected moment came when I was invited to speak at a regional leadership summit. The request came from the VP of Operations himself. He said he'd read the audit report, seen the changes in our department's performance, and wanted me to share our story. Not Heather's downfall, but our recovery. I stood in front of a crowd of over 100 managers and executives and told them about transformation, about the importance of emotional safety in leadership, about the cost of silence and the value of clarity. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. The story told itself. After the summit, a woman from another office approached me, eyes wide, voice trembling. She said, "You just told my story. I thought I was crazy. I thought I was alone. And I realized I hadn't just taken down a toxic boss. I had exposed a pattern that far too many women live through quietly, thinking they're the only ones. I had turned my personal revenge into a ripple of something larger, something useful." That night, I sat alone in my apartment, lights low, a glass of wine in hand, and I thought about the version of me who used to cry in stairwells, who used to wonder if she was imagining everything. I thought about how close I came to quitting, to disappearing, and I whispered into the quiet, "Thank you for not giving up." Because the revenge? That already happened. This now, this power, this peace, this purpose, that was the real victory. I never imagined my story would end like this, not with a dramatic confrontation, not with slam doors or public takedowns, but with stillness, peace, the kind of quiet that isn't empty but earned. It's been 6 months since Heather left the company, and most days now, I don't think about her. When I do, it's fleeting, like remembering a nightmare you no longer fear. There's no more anger, no lingering bitterness, only a strange sense of clarity. She was never the center of the story. She was just the obstacle I had to outgrow to finally become who I always was underneath the fear. That's the funny thing about revenge. People think it's about rage, about destruction, about making someone else suffer. But the real revenge, the kind that lasts, is becoming untouchable. Not because you're cruel or cold, but because you finally realize your value has never depended on their approval. These days, my mornings start differently. I wake up with ease, not dread. I don't check my phone immediately. I don't rehearse conversations in the shower or brace myself for comments disguised as compliments. I drink my coffee slowly. I dress with intention. I take up space without apology. At work, people don't walk on eggshells anymore. They speak freely, collaborate openly. Our team is thriving. Productivity is up, yes, but more importantly, morale is solid. People stay late not because they're afraid, but because they care, because they feel safe. That's what I helped build, not just a functioning department, but a culture where people can breathe. Sometimes I catch my reflection in the glass doors of the office building as I walk in, and I barely recognize the woman staring back. Not because I look so different, though I do, but because I stand differently. I walk like I belong, like I don't have to prove anything to anyone. That woman is not invisible. That woman fought tooth and nail for a place at the table, then turned around and built a bigger one with room for everyone who was once told they were too much or not enough. I think back to the day I first realized Heather had a problem with me, that sickening mix of confusion and self-doubt, the whispered jokes, the stolen credit, the manipulations behind closed doors. I think of the nights I sat in my kitchen cataloging every offense, trying to decide if I was overreacting, if I should just stay quiet and write it out like I always had. And I think of the moment it all shifted, when I chose to act, to trust myself, to risk being called difficult or dramatic or paranoid because my truth was louder than my fear. That moment was the real turning point, not the investigation, not her firing. The real victory was in refusing to disappear. Sometimes people ask me what I would say to her if I ever saw her again. I've thought about that. I imagine running into her at a conference or in line at a coffee shop, and for a second she sees me and remembers everything. What would I say? Maybe nothing. Maybe I'd just smile, or maybe I'd say thank you, not out of kindness, but truth. Because she gave me the final push I needed to stop shrinking. Her cruelty forced me to step into my voice, my power, my worth. And I'll never go back. This isn't a cautionary tale, this is a survival story, a reclamation, a quiet rebellion turned loud. And if someone out there is reading this, still sitting at their desk wondering if they're crazy, wondering if the jokes and exclusions and sideways glances mean what they think they do, believe yourself. You're not imagining it. And you don't have to stay silent. She wanted me gone, she wanted me small. Instead, I stayed, I grew, I thrived, and she became a footnote. A lesson in what happens when you try to bury someone who knows how to rise. Because I didn't just survive her, I outlived her in every room she tried to keep me out of, and that's the ending she never saw coming.